Monroe. I'm chair of the Scottish Fabians, and I'm delighted to be joined by such a great panel of speakers today to ask where Labour's devolution project should go now. Devolution isn't just about sterile constitutional change, and it's not an end in itself. It needs to deliver better and more responsive government, which allows communities to be better represented. It needs to deliver better public services to prove that it's actually a better way to govern. So what has Labour in Wales done right that Labour in Scotland has failed to grasp? And what can North of England, at the very start of its devolution journey, learn from both? And what role does identity politics play in all of this? Can Labour be seen again as speaking for the people of Scotland and the red wall seats? And how has Welsh Labour managed to maintain this? In terms of practicalities, those who've been participating in the conference already this morning will know already that there's a chat function for the audience to chat amongst themselves. Separately, though, you can put your questions into the questions and answers function, and I'll invite the person to ask his or her question orally, and then I'll put it to the panel. Please tweet about the session if you'd like to do so. I'm going to ask the panelists to speak in the following order: Martin, then Alison, then Douglas, and then Beth, and then I'll open it to the audience for questions. So our first speaker is Martin Mccluskey, who's a doctoral researcher at Edinburgh University and director of Kemphock & Co. Campaigns Consultancy. He was Labour's candidate in Inverclyde in 2017 and 2019, and a Labour advisor in various forms from 2012 to 2017. For the past year, he's been carrying out a major piece of research work for the Scottish Fabians, funded by FET. And that will be launched in the coming weeks, but we're going to get a bit of a sneak preview today. So, Martin, politically, how does Labour take back control of devolution and make this its project?
Thanks, Katrina, and thanks to the Scottish Fabians for hosting this morning. I think the first thing to say is it's really welcome that we're having a debate on devolution again, and that we heard just before Christmas from Keir Starmer about how Labour would actually come up with a constitutional offer for the whole of the UK. I think it's first important to remember that in 1997, when Labour put in place the legislation for the referendums on Scottish and Welsh devolution, it was one of the first pieces of legislation that Labour passed, and we came to government not just with plans to come up with a plan, but actually with a concrete, fleshed out plan that we were able to put into legislation immediately. And I think what's so welcome about what Keir's done so far is that we are actually planning to go into the 2024 election with a plan for our constitutional future, which is more than we had in 2017 and 2019. What I want to do this morning is basically be a bit of the kind of ghost of devolution past when it comes to Scotland, and use some of the research that we've done for the FEPS project, which Katrina spoke about, just to kind of give a sense of some of the things that we need to be thinking about as we kind of step onto this journey again. I'm going to share my screen with people just so you can see hopefully you'll be able to see a graph, and as long as you can see a line going from about 45% right down to 18%, you'll get the point that I'm trying to make. And this is really a reminder of why we're here this morning and what we're trying to avoid. This is what we can't allow to happen as we start to think about constitutional politics again. This is the vote share for Scottish Labour at both Holyrood and Westminster elections since 1997/1999. From a point in Westminster elections when we were getting over 45% of the vote to in 2019 ending on less than 20%, and also at this point in time about to elect or select our 10th leader of the devolution era. Now, I'm sure Beth will talk later about what Wales did differently to Scotland, and therefore how they've managed to avoid this kind of decline. But for the moment, I'd just like to kind of turn to some of the things in Scotland where I think they should act as a bit of a warning for Labour elsewhere in the UK as we think about devolution. And I think the first point, the overarching point I want to make this morning is that alongside a constitutional a constitutional plan, there also needs to be a political plan running alongside that to actually think about how Labour best succeeds in a devolved era. And there's three kind of warnings from the Scottish experience and from the research that we've been doing over the last year that people need to bear in mind. The first, and it is on identity. So Labour actually needs to start to grapple with issues around identity in a way that it maybe hasn't in the past. Welsh Labour seems to have done much better than a job at this than we have, and I think that's something Beth will speak about later. Where Labour in the 1980s and the 1990s in Scotland really managed to kind of inhabit sort of cultural nationalism and keep political nationalism at bay, what seems to have happened over the past 10 to 15 years is that kind of cultural nationalist speaking up for Scotland space has just been inhabited by the SNP almost exclusively, and then with no alternative voice that people can see, or a party speaking up for Scotland, they have turned to the SNP, and that's because, as our research for FEPS found, the kind of mainstream middle of Scottish politics is one that isn't just interested in social justice issues and isn't just interested in jobs in the economy, but is also proudly, patriotically Scottish. And that's something that for the recent past in Scottish Labour, we have found really, really difficult to grapple with, and find it really difficult to actually speak to that sense of Scottish identity in our politics. So as other parts of the Labour Party start to grapple with the issue of further devolution, actually thinking about identity issues are going to be crucial. And I think one thing that was mentioned, this was actually in a piece by Professor Nicola McEwen at Edinburgh University more than 10 years ago, and she said there was a tension in the way that the Labour Party approached devolution, which was one between a desire to modernise the state and a desire to express identity. So with the Scottish devolution project in the late 90s and early noughties, there was a tension between those who just thought it was about a way to modernise the British state and those who thought it was actually a way to give expression to identity. And when we think about the constitutional future for the rest of the UK, I think it's important that Labour actually understands why it's doing this. Is it just about pushing power closer to people, or is it actually about allowing people to express their own regional identities or whatever local identity in their politics? And I would argue it's also has to encompass the latter. The second thing that we need to be careful about, and again, this comes from the FEPS research, is devolving with purpose. So we have ended up in Scotland in a position where we really had a kind of auction of powers over the past decades, where any hint of increasing support for independence is responded to with increased powers for the Scottish Parliament. And it's really debatable as to whether or not that has actually led to good public policy outcomes, and certainly not good political outcomes for anyone other than the SNP. In the FEPS research, what we found was that there's a total lack of understanding about what power lies where. And for anyone who actually cares about good governance, for anyone who cares about the accountability of government, that's a bad place to be if the public don't understand what power government actually has. So just two figures leapt out at us from the research. 20% of people in Scotland thought that the NHS was reserved to Westminster. So in other words, that the NHS was under the control of the Conservative government in London. And on the flip side, going in the other direction, a third of people thought that social security, so benefits largely, were already devolved to the Scottish Parliament and were already under the control of Holyrood. Now, two massive public policy areas and a significant proportion of people in each who have a complete lack of understanding about where those powers lie. Now, that's not something to blame voters for not understanding. I think that's probably incumbent on anyone involved in politics that we haven't maybe necessarily explained that to people or educated people about devolution in the best possible way. But it's certainly, as we think about how we might start to devolve elsewhere in the UK, especially in England, it's something to think about, that we don't end up in that same position 10, 15 years down the line in England. And the third point, very briefly, and I think this is something that's sometimes missed in these discussions but shouldn't be, we need to actually think about the Labour Party as well. I think in 1999, a kind of accusation that could be made of the Labour Party is we came with a very well thought out constitutional position, but we didn't necessarily have a political plan about how the Labour Party would prosper under devolution. And so if we're going to embark on new stages of devolution across the whole of the UK, we need to think about how the Labour Party is going to hold together, and also how the Labour Party is going to change to respond to it. We are still a party that is very centralised, that is very focused on often on kind of one level of our government, which is in the UK Parliament. And if we are going to be serious about devolving to the country, we also need to be serious about devolving within the Labour Party. So that means more investment in not just in the nation, but also in English regions to build up infrastructure that is actually alongside these new levels of devolved power. It means actually, moving much more out of London, and not just to like the headquarters in Newcastle, but devolving that all around the country. And importantly, investing in a talent pool that can find its way into any devolved or local government levels that we might introduce, because we need to make sure that we have high quality representatives at every level of government. That's not to say we don't right now, we do, but we need to make sure that if there's going to be more levels of government in 20 years, that we have good Labour representatives being elected into these assemblies, local government chambers, whatever they might end up be. So I'll leave it there, but 3 warnings, I suppose, from Scotland and the research about what we might want to think about over the next period of time. Thanks, Katrina.
Thanks, Martin. I think it's really interesting that there's so little understanding, or so many misunderstandings about where powers lie, and that has serious consequences for accountability. And I suppose is something that we need to think about when broadening out the devolution offer. So that brings me to Allison Mcgovern, who's been Labour MP for Wirral South since 2010. She's currently Shadow Minister for Sport in Keir Starmer's team, and she was previously in the Shadow Treasury team. Her seat was a Tory seat until 1997, and Allison won it with a fairly slim majority in 2010, but has since gained a more secure majority. She has spoken up for membership of the single market and the customs union, and has strongly advocated for her constituents harmed by Brexit. Alison, how could legislative devolution be extended to the English regions, and what are the different challenges that this presents? What powers could be devolved?
Thank you, Katrina, and thanks everybody. And it's really good to have Martin's analysis as well. It's really helpful. Can everybody hear me okay? I still am getting used to this whole video thing, and it feels very weird to not be in a room with people. I feel a lack of that, especially on days like this when it would normally be so good to get together with fellow Fabians. I want to sort of answer that question by talking about, I guess, the principle of devolution and some of the identity issues that Martin spoke about, because I think he's right. You need to know what devolution is for, and that is definitely true in England as much as it is elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But it's interesting, the idea of identity politics, because I think there's a lot of people on the left who feel like identity politics is some sort of existential threat, and I really disagree with that, because all we're talking about is who we are and what we want for the world. So let me just say, firstly, Martin's right. In politics, you have to have purpose above all else. And there is no point for us talking about the Constitution or legal niceties, because that is not our politics. We have to ask ourselves what we're here for. And I think the Labour Party's primary job is to get things for people. And specifically at the moment, given the situation we face with poverty and inequality that's exacerbated by the current pandemic, I think at the top of our list should be money in people's pockets. And it's really interesting, Martin's point about people thinking that social security in Scotland is already devolved, because actually, I think if we're going to make an argument for the United Kingdom, which I believe very strongly that we must do, I think we need to understand exactly how we do redistribution and how inequality is tackled. And that is by people paying into the UK Treasury, those that are able to, and then the UK Treasury with its mighty heft, making sure that money gets to the people who need it in order to tackle inequality in our country. And people in Scotland and Wales and all over Northern Ireland and England have a lot to contribute to that process and hopefully have a lot to gain. It's why cooperation works and is foundational to our politics. I think, you know, the same arguments can be made about the economic and fiscal heft of the European Union. However, we lost that argument and we are where we are. So, but with the United Kingdom, for me, the best argument for it is what it can do given its financial heft and the role that the UK Treasury plays. So we have to be clear about what the purpose of devolution is for. And I want to say a couple of things about that, particularly with reference to England, if I may, because, you know, I would agree with Martin. I think that we sometimes look, I'm even hesitating now to talk about patriotism. However, I am a deeply, deeply patriotic person, but I listen to Boris Johnson talk about patriotism and I hear him essentially discussing other people's achievements. You know, he talks about the past. He talks about what happened many years ago in the past. And I think, yeah, we should be proud of our country, but that's just other people's achievements. And to me, that's not patriotism. What being patriotic really is about what you do to serve your country and what you give to our country. And I think the measure for all of us in our patriotism is not somehow borrowing the glories of our past, even if that wasn't problematic in and of itself, given what we also know about our country, but it ought to be a measure of the service that we owe other people. And in that sense, let me talk about England. Can I just say to everybody, this terminology of like red wall, I'm going to say it once, red wall, and it's banned, because, you know, nobody who lives in any part of England refers to themselves as living in that place. It's a terminology that was invented in Conservative central office and then repeated ad nauseum by Tory journalists. So don't buy into it. If you are talking about a place that we lost in the 2019 general election, then say Darlington, or say Blythe, or say Delin, say the place that you mean, because the more we use that terminology to group a bunch of people in England as a certain kind of thing, the more we other those people. And that is not where the Labour Party ought to be. We are in people's communities, and our politics is drawn from our understanding of that fine-grained detail of what it's like to be from a place. And speaking of what it's like to be from a place, I speak to you from lovely Wirral in Merseyside, where we have a very strong sense of our own identity. And the recent strides forward that we have made on devolution have been drawn from that sense that we want Merseyside to be a place where you don't have to leave it in order to have a good career and to have a job. And I think matching that sense of economic purpose, ambition for our people, and a sense of who we are and how we do things is what can make devolution a real success. And just final point on that, we do need to make devolution a success because we have a purpose to tackle inequality and to have economic regeneration in places that need it. And that is very, very important in regions of England. There's actually a larger, in output terms, there's a bigger gap between the northeast and the northwest now than between the northwest and London. So this is a situation that has been bad for some time and is getting worse for some places, the combined efforts of Brexit and the pandemic making that worse. And I'll just say very quickly, 2 points on economic regeneration and how it will be driven by devolution. some parts of England are being told a lie. They're being sold nostalgia by the Tories. And we know, don't we, that nostalgia is essentially this seductive lie that says the problem that you've got isn't to do with the government in London or governments anywhere else. It's because the world has moved on from when you were in your 20s. And even I fall into that. Trap. You know, I could be convinced that the music scene in the 1990s in Merseyside, it was far better than it is now. But of course, it's not the case. And this seductive lie that's being told to people, you know, that you can have all of these old industries back, is not fair. But in order to counter that, we need an idea of a broad-based economic growth plan that says the productivity change that we need for our country is not just about, as Dominic Cummings had it, about the government investing in essentially kind of mad ideas so that we might get 1 or 2 unicorns, so that tech entrepreneurs, several of them, could become billionaires in the UK. We need to make incremental improvements in productivity so that the kind of jobs people do are not just minimum wage jobs, but are jobs where they can move on and move upwards and develop their skills. It'd be much better to have millions of people make marginal improvements in their skill level and in their income level than to have just 1 or 2 people become very successful. It'd be better for our tax base, and it would be far better for inequality. But in order to counter both the nostalgia and also this kind of myth of what productivity needs, we need strong devolved institutions in every part of England that are capable of making that economic policy and delivering on it. And I could talk for about 4 hours about what that means. So Katrina, I'm going to leave it there and not test your patience anymore. Thank you.
That was great, Alison. And the words red wall will never appear in my vocabulary again. Lesson learned. So over to Douglas. Douglas probably does need no introduction. He first came to prominence when he fought the Perth and Kinross by-election in 1999. He cut his political teeth in that hotly contested by-election, and although he didn't win, he succeeded in pushing the incumbent Tories into 3rd place. He fought the seat again in the 1997 election and lost it, but later the same year, his local seat of Paisley South became vacant. He was selected and he won. Since then, he's held cabinet positions in transport and international development, and then shadow cabinet positions in work and pensions, and as shadow foreign secretary. I think Douglas is one of the very few people who really managed to demolish Nicola Sturgeon in the discussions in the independence referendum. Douglas, you were an important player right at the start of devolution. How do you think it's played out, and what do you think Labour's vision for the future should be?
Katrina, thank you, and thank you to the Scottish Fabians for organising this event. I see from the chat room that apparently I am upside down in some people's view, so I want to begin both by denying I have emigrated and joined the Australian Labour Party, or that this is some kind of clever visual metaphor for the state of the Scottish Labour Party 20 years after devolution. But if I am still upside down, maybe just put the camera off and hopefully some words will make sense. Thank you also to Martin and to Alison. I thought they were characteristically brilliant presentations. If we've started with kind of slides and economics, I want to do something different and just start with a story and emotion, because I think that's part of what we need to get comfortable with in understanding a politics of place and of identity. You're right, I joined the Labour Party in 1982. I am that old. In the immediate aftermath of the closure of the Linwood car plant in Renfrewshire, the seat that I went on to represent. And my political journey was really undertaken in the shadow of deindustrialisation. The mills that had defined Paisley to the world in the 19th century and 20th century closed, but they didn't close in the last 5 or 10 years. They closed in 1970 or in 1980. But they continued to dominate the consciousness of the community in which I grew up. My office, when I was the MP, actually was in one of the reconditioned office buildings of the mill. Why do I mention that? Because actually in the final election that I fought in 2015, I was conscious in the immediate aftermath of that referendum of the surge in emotional power around a politics of identity. And I tried to match that with an appeal to solidarity and to class. And my dad's a minister in the Church of Scotland. It was like a minister trying to lead a congregation in a hymn that they had long forgotten the words to, in the sense that I am just old enough that people made sense of their struggles when I joined the Labour Party in Renfrewshire in relation to class and affinity with institutions of working class life, large industrial workplaces, trade union membership, church attendance. That world has vanished. And in that sense, we need to navigate a way forward for Labour politics in a circumstance where many of the traditional bearers of working class identity have disappeared underneath us. But what does that mean for us in relation to devolution? The best shorthand I can offer to colleagues and comrades across England in understanding what's happened to the Scottish Labour Party during those 20 years of devolution is this. To be working class in Paisley in the 19th and 20th century was an achieved identity. You made things that mattered with your hands. Ships, steel, whatever the products, cotton, the products that you made. That gave you a sense of agency and place in the world. But you probably also either lived in a dry council house or bought a council house for the first time in your life. Your family went on a foreign holiday for the first time in your life. You bought a car for the first time in your life. And you genuinely believed that your kids were going to do better than yourselves. Now, what we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years with deindustrialization is every one of those achievements have been stripped away from a high proportion of people in the community in which I grew up. But what happens when you lose that achieved identity is not that you don't have an identity, you default to a deeper assigned identity. And in Scotland's case, that's overwhelmingly been, I'm Scottish. If you look in the United States, it's very often, I'm American or even I'm white. But we need to reconcile ourselves to the truth that identity politics is deep. It's not superficial, and it certainly involves money, but it also involves meaning. And actually, there is a status hunger in large parts of the United Kingdom who feel disdained and ignored by the central powers that exist predominantly in London. So I am a passionate advocate of devolution, notwithstanding that having been the context in which we saw Martin's slide and the slide in support for the Labour Party. But my plea to colleagues across the country would be, don't think that a constitutional solution is adequate to what we've experienced in Scotland or what you're experiencing in other parts of the country. I believe we need to be literate and comfortable with a politics of symbol, of identity, of place, and of patriotism. But our offer must always be founded, as Alison suggested, in a promise not just of constitutional renewal, but of social and economic renewal as well. And in that sense, that places a heavy burden of responsibility on us, not just to devolve power so that power is rendered accountable, but also to empower communities that feel systemically disempowered by economic forces beyond their control to this day. So in that sense, my plea would be, we absolutely should welcome what Keir announced before Christmas in relation to Scotland, but we shouldn't think about the constitutional architecture any longer as being, how do we have a bespoke solution for Scotland? The only prospect, I think, for reclaiming that ground in Scotland is if people genuinely believe this is a UK-wide initiative in which Scotland can find its home. And in truth, we are being pushed out of the Union in Scotland at the moment by a sense of revulsion at what we're witnessing in Boris Johnson's government. It is an eminently winnable case if we are able, under Keir's leadership, to make the United Kingdom a more habitable place for many Scots to imagine themselves and their kids growing up. So in that sense, I think constitutional politics and devolution has a big part to play, but it is only ever going to be one tool in our toolkit. And we need to be comfortable with a politics of place and symbolism, but at the same time, we need to be answering much deeper questions in relation to meaning and money, rather than simply seeing there as being a constitutional solution.
Thanks, Douglas. And now over to Beth. Beth Winter has been MP for Kinnan Valley since the 2019 general election, succeeding Anne Clwyd. She's worked in community development, housing and homelessness, and on social care and research into ageing. Her priorities include ending austerity, stopping privatisation of the NHS and tackling climate change. But today we're going to ask her the question, how has Labour in Wales managed this? On the face of it, it's cracked it. What has Welsh Labour done right that others can learn from?
Diolch yn fawr, a diolch yn fawr am y gwahoddiad I ddod I siarad heddiw. Mae'n bleser enfawr I fod yma. Thank you very much for the invite. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. So Wales does have a radical tradition, from the first raising of the red flag above Merthyr Tydfil in the Charter year to the establishment of the NHS. And last year marked the 21st anniversary of the establishment of the Welsh Parliament, renamed the Senedd for Wales, with a Labour-led government. And indeed, we are the only nation in the UK that currently has a Labour-led government. Now, for me, devolution isn't an abstract concept. It's got very real consequences for people and communities. We've got a lot to be proud of here in Wales. It's what allowed Welsh Government to develop more ambitious policies, protect the NHS as a publicly owned service. We've passed a climate emergency. We're the first with the Wellbeing Future Generation Act. And for the first time this year in the Senedd elections, 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote. And we have, in terms of identity politics, made a lot of progress in terms of the Welsh language. And we have a target to get 1 million Welsh speakers here in Wales. So identity is key to devolution here in Wales. We've also helped lead the way in developing an inclusive, largely foundational economy, taking a social partnership approach, promote things like fair work, safeguarding workers' rights, and promote the principle of public investment and employment with a social and community purpose. However, this has all been achieved and done within a background of a complete lack of adequate funding. A decade of brutal austerity has stripped Welsh councils of over £1.6 billion from their budgets. And the Barmit formula is clearly ill-equipped to meet Wales' funding needs. And we can't make any mistake about this. The Tory government currently is moving towards centralising power and riding roughshod over the devolution settlement. Just a few examples: the Internal Market Bill and the Brexit Bill, a total lack of consultation with the devolved nations, and does give UK government more powers over the devolved nations. A very, very worrying time, and I'm sure this may be covered in some of the questions that come up. The Shared Prosperity Fund, Wales has benefited substantially from that. But again, the UK government seems to be moving to centralising power and control of the funding that is allocated, and we're likely to get less funding. Very worrying times for us in the future. And COVID again has clearly exemplified, one, the extreme inequalities that exist throughout the UK, but it has also highlighted the differences, divergence between the devolved nations, and again, the lack of cooperation from UK government. And if you look at an example, would be the October firebreak that Wales introduced. We weren't given any additional funding. I know the same applied in regions within England, and Liverpool and Manchester. Andy Burnham's work again exemplifies the way in which UK government does not take into account the needs and the importance of the regions and nations of the UK. And it was only when Southern England went back into lockdown that funding became available to us here in Wales. Political and spending decisions should be made as close to the people they affect as possible. And this is a fundamental principle of devolution. And it's unacceptable that Tories are trying to stealthily roll this back. And we cannot allow this to happen. And I really do believe that we're at a critical juncture in terms of democracy and devolution here in the UK. Currently, there are two opposing choices that seem to dominate the debate. You've got unionism on the one hand, separatism on the other. But there is a growing call and a need to explore a third way. And this is what I want to focus on in the last few minutes, or seconds, should I say, probably. Now, Keir Starmer's announcement of a constitutional commission to spread power, wealth and opportunity out to Westminster is very welcome. Here in Wales on Thursday was the launch of We the People, Case for Radical Federalism report by a group of Welsh Labour Party members, and I must make a mention of Mick Anthony, who did a lot of the work on this, calling for the devolved nations to be handed greater powers. And I fully support this initiative. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, please download the document. And there is a Twitter page that you can access as well. So under this plan, the people of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England should be offered the opportunity to make a positive choice and make their voices heard in determining the kind of constitutional future that we want to see. At the core of this UK transformed vision lies a commitment to the decentralisation of power, with people and communities having powers to make decisions that affect our lives. And it's underpinned by core values, which other speakers have mentioned themselves, about democracy, fairness, justice, climate stability, equality, and yes, identity. The key proposals, and I've taken these from the document. UK should become a voluntary union of nations and regions, with the UK state performing only those strategic tasks which could not be performed at a much more local level. A UK framework would guarantee minimum and common standards in health, social welfare, human rights, education and housing across the UK, allowing the constituent nations to set their own levels above that minimum, not below, above. A fair share of resources and prosperity across the whole of the UK on a needs-based principle, not population, which is currently the case with the Barnett formula. Regions, cities and localities of England should be given the freedom to design, through participatory people's assemblies, a model of devolved governance appropriate to their particular needs and wishes. And local authorities must have parity of esteem and partnership with central and devolved legislators. So to conclude, we need a debate about devolution, and this We the People initiative is a start for that for us here in Wales. So we need the debate about how we increase public and community involvement in the political world. We need to reach out across parties, in my view, and engage with a diverse range of political, civic and progressive organisations to develop a new reform agenda for a future radical federal UK, in order to give future generations across the UK a fairer, greener, socialist future. Diolch yn fawr am eich amser. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Beth. That was a very inspiring end, so thank you for that. We have quite a number of questions coming in, so I'll go first to Kat Headley. If you could give your question orally, that would be great. Kath will unmute you. Kat, I think you're on. Kat, we can't hear you. Okay, doesn't seem to be working. So I'll read out Kat's question, which is, how does UK, Scottish and Welsh Labour send tailored messages on identity and nation to the voters that need to hear it in a media environment where the majority of people get their news at UK level? Shall I ask Alison to address that question first?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think it's really problematic where you've got devolved institutions, and I know that there's been a discussion for some time, particularly around the confusion that can be caused by, you know, when you're interviewing like the schools minister and they're referred to as the schools minister rather than the schools minister for England. I think that's really problematic. And I think that UK media broadcasters need to be a lot more careful and a lot more proactive in how they discuss it. Second point, this is not just, however, a problem of UK versus those places that have devolved institutions with significant responsibilities, because the news that is produced in the UK often feels like it has very little to do with anything outside some kind of London bubble. And I'm not even sure it serves people who are not a part of the internal media culture in London that well either. I'm not sure it serves like working class kids in South London very well either. And I think that's a much bigger question for the media itself, in how they recruit journalists, how they what has value in news. But I do see this problem all the time, and it's part of how we change Britain so that the power and influence that the media has reflects Britain as it is now, not based on some kind of like power structure that has been created over time. Final point, really amusing moment recently where journalists were complaining about lack of access to hospitals, and that it would be helpful for them to be able to tell a story of what was going on inside COVID wards. Meanwhile, the Liverpool Echo in my area had been, writing the story from inside the Royal Hospital in Liverpool city centre for months. Any of them could have picked it up. Any of them could have run with it. But there is that problem of how people see what news is, and I think that's where we have to really change that. But I would just really like to see everybody to do a lot better, to be more accurate in how we talk about these responsibilities, because that's why we have the problem that Martin describes, where people don't really know who has power over what.
Thanks, Alison. So over to Martin actually next, I think, because that ties in with what you were talking about the information that people have and their lack of understanding of how devolution actually works. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much to what Alison has already said, other than to just maybe say that the resourcing of the media is really important. Like, I think in Scotland now we've probably got a less well-resourced media environment than we did, certainly in terms of newspapers, than was there 20 or 25 years ago, which is really startling when you consider how much more power is in the Scottish Parliament now than there was then, or it didn't even exist then. So I think resourcing of local media is really important. How we do that, I'm not quite sure. Some people have said there needs to be more BBC funding pushed out to local newspapers. I don't necessarily think that's the answer, but even just look in the last 2 weeks in Scotland, like you've had the Scotsman sold again. That something that used to be a major national title, you can't even I'm in the west of Scotland, you can't even get a copy of the Scotsman on a newsstand anymore in the west coast of Scotland. That's how hollowed out it's become. In Wales similarly, Beth will know this far better than me, but work that I've done in Wales in the past, the Press Association shares a Welsh correspondent with Bristol, who's also meant to cover goings on in the Welsh Parliament, and that's just not sustainable again if more power goes to these institutions. So alongside a discussion about further devolution, there's no point in devolving power. Well, for a lot of the reasons that Alison mentioned, there's no point in devolving power for a lot of reasons. There's no point in devolving power if then the whole purpose of it, i.e. people being able to hold their representatives to account, can't happen because we don't have a healthy democratic environment, including the media around it. So it's something that I think, if it may not appear at first something that's important in a constitutional convention, but it should be something that Labour's considering as part of these discussions over the next couple of years.
Beth, what's the situation with the media in Wales? Are you in the same boat as Scotland, where there is effectively hollowed out media?
Yes, and I think again, COVID has really highlighted the problems that have existed, and the lack of consultation by the media as well as the UK government in terms of the messaging with regards to COVID has really caused us issues here in Wales. But I would commend Welsh Government to doing its utmost really to redress the balance. We've had daily updates on Welsh news, and we've got the Welsh media, which we're very proud of in here. in Wales. And I do agree with Martin's comments about resourcing. And if we're talking about devolution, decentralisation of power, the media do have a role to play in that. I would finally just add that there are different methods of the media, and social media is obviously a big factor, and we use that in innovative ways here in Wales to try and get our messaging across. And we cannot take anything away from actually speaking and going out. I know we can't physically go out, but actually communicating with people in different ways, because the media is only one way in which people can identify with their nation, community. And, you know, we've got to look at different ways of doing this moving forward. But it really has been an issue for us here in Wales. Thanks.
Douglas, do you have anything to add? I was thinking that you and I are both old enough to remember when the Scotsman had a big building on the bridges in Edinburgh, and then moved down to an equally lavish building, which is now a games company, sign of our times.
Absolutely. And Martin Mccluskey had an article in the Scotsman last week. That's how big the change is in the Scotsman. I think I'm probably one of the very few readers who actually had the privilege of reading it. In all seriousness, I'm more optimistic than some of the comments we've heard today, because listen, as the Labour Party, we need to be in the persuasion business. You know, we need to win power to be able to deliver for the people we came into politics to serve. And if you want to persuade, you need to have trust. And to have trust, you need to look like and sound like the people you're trying to persuade. And there has never been greater opportunities for individual Labour Party members to influence debate in their communities than the advent of social media. And goodness knows I know all the horrors that social media has also delivered. But on the other hand, I don't think we should rage against the changing media landscape. We should say, how do we utilise the changing media landscape to advance our politics? And the truth is, having Labour Party members who are, I mean, Twitter is the domain mostly of political activists and journalists and others, but being on Facebook, being on other social platforms, advocating for the difference that Labour can make, I think is an opportunity that was never there for previous generations who would have worked hard to write an op-ed piece in the Scotsman or to talk to a journalist. Actually, I think we've got unprecedented opportunities to influence the local conversations, and I wouldn't underestimate just how potent individual Labour Party members can be in that endeavour.
Very interesting, and I think good to end on a more optimistic note on that question. Can I go next to Christabel Cooper, and we'll try the tech again. We will hope that it works this time. Christabel.
Is that working?
Aha.
Hello.
Success. Hi.
Yeah, so my question, I think everything that's been said about identity is right, but if we're going to have successful devolution as opposed to independence movements, then we need to build multiple layers of identity, in that we need to, you know, people need to feel both Scottish and British, or even sort of from London and British, or, you know, from Merseyside and British. How do we both allow people to express an identity based on their locality and encourage that shared sense of British identity without setting, oh, sorry, dog interrupting there, without setting regions against each other? That's my question.
Great, really interesting question. A lot of the panelists have already mentioned identity politics, and so I think that it ties in well with that. I think I'll go to Beth first on this one.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I was on mute then. I think for us in Wales here, the debate is recommencing in terms of devolution and decentralisation and power. And I am absolutely committed, and my background is such that I can see how it works. We've got to take a bottom-up approach. And the first step for me is about going out and asking people in communities at a local level, what does identity mean for them? What does devolution mean for them? How can it manifest it? How can the intersection between identity, class, race, the diversity that exists in every community, how can that be harnessed and brought together in a meaningful way? And what structures at a micro, meso and macro level need to be in place to enable the proper and meaningful devolution, which I think must happen at all those levels of power, that it can work for everybody. So for me, this is a start of a conversation, and the event on Thursday, and I would really encourage people to have a look at the document, which has got some clear suggestions in terms of structures that can exist, and how we can work realistically for everyone. But it's about going out and having these conversations and being honest about the limitations, the challenges, but it's not insurmountable. And things like, people's assemblies, having forums where we can discuss and debate these issues is really important. And we have achieved, I think, we have got some of this right in Wales. We've got a very strong culture, a very strong tradition. There has been a growth in the Welsh language, and we do have, and I've got a very Welsh identity. I feel Welsh, but at the same time, I do feel British, and class politics is extremely important to me. So the intersections are there, and they need to be harnessed. So I'm optimistic, but we've got to go out and have these conversations. We've got to take a bottom-up approach to this if we're going to get it right in a way that works for everybody. Diolch yn fawr.
Martin, the research that you have been doing with FEPS over the last year or so has looked quite closely at identity and how people self-identify. What are your thoughts on how politically we can make something of this and use it effectively?
So I'd be lying if I said the FEPS research is going to come to a conclusion about this question, because this is the question. In my eyes anyway, and from what we discovered during the research. Like, I'd go as far as saying that there, and others may disagree, but I'd go as far as saying that there is no shared view of what being British means anymore. Like, I think there's pockets of people who would agree, but there was a good piece of research done that I saw before Christmas. I can't remember who did it, but it was asking people in England and Scotland, and this was just England and Scotland, what they meant by Britishness. So, for example, in England, British and people who have British values are generally more pro-EU, generally more to the left. Whereas in Scotland, people who identify as British and have British values are more to the right and identify more with the Leave campaign. So there's no sense of shared British experience in people's eyes at the moment. And I think actually that is the challenge for us. And because I think it's easier to see how individual bits of the Labour Party around the UK might make themselves more palatable to their own national or regional areas. It is impossible to see how then all hangs together. And I think the only way it ever will hang together is if we actually start to put the kind of hard yards into actually thinking about what does Britishness mean. And, this is a question that we've been over probably for the last, I think for the whole time I've been a member of the Labour Party, we've had this debate about what does being British mean, but it's not been any more important than now. Like, if we can't answer that question, we're going to find it very, very difficult to then answer questions about why the UK, what holds us together as a nation, all of that kind of stuff. So, this question is foundational to everything else. And we have managed to do it in the past. I don't think the answers in the past are the answers now. But if you go back to speeches that Donald Dewar was giving in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, and he talked about dual identity in the same way that J.P. McIntosh spoke about dual identity in the 1970s when he wrote his pieces on devolution. Like, we have had this debate inside the Labour Party and on the left before and come up with an answer. And I don't think there's any reason why we can't have the same debate and discussion again and come up with a solution. But I've not got a solution to come to this panel with today, other than to say we need to have that discussion.
Alison, you said that rather than viewing identity politics as an existential threat, we should sort of embrace it. But what does it mean to be from the north of England, or does it, do we have to look at smaller subsets? Being from Merseyside, is that the identity that we should embrace? How do we make political capital out of that? Oh, we've lost Alison. While we try to get Alison back, I'll turn to Douglas for some thoughts on identity politics.
I feel a very poor substitute for Alison, but I'll do my best. Again, let's start with the personal. I feel very comfortable being proudly, passionately, irredeemably Scottish, but that not being in tension with having a pluralist, layered identity. I'm comfortable being British and being European as well. But that reflects the fact that I have led a life of significant privilege relative to a lot of people in Scotland, for whom identity has become a function of a scarcity mentality, that their economic security has been taken away, their sense of confidence and optimism has been taken away, and they feel, well, you can take all that away from me, but you're not going to take my Scottishness, because I still matter, my community still matters, and I demand you recognise that Scottishness. And in that sense, I completely agree with the points that Beth and Alison have made in terms of there needs to be a class and economic dimension to our response to this, because unless we break the currency of politics being scarcity, progressive politics is always going to struggle. But in that sense, as well as taking economic steps, I think there are steps that we can take in relation to identity. One of the tragedies of the Boris Johnson government is most of us look at it and we don't see ourselves. We don't see people who look like us, who have the lived experience like us. And in that sense, if we saw a lot more of MPs like Alison on our television screens in Scotland, making the case for the union would be a whole lot easier than Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And so I think we've got to think, what are the places and spaces where we can create a culture of encounter where people realise what they hold in common? And in that sense, I would make some basic recommendations. The Scottish Government gets up every morning and says, how do we make people feel in Scotland that the price of being Scottish is that you need to see someone like Alison as a foreigner? We need to respond to that. So why don't we say, we as the British Government will fund every primary school pupil in Scotland to do a 2-week exchange in a primary school in England, and they'll take the whole class. And actually, just the lived experience of spending time in Newcastle or Birmingham or Liverpool would profoundly challenge the cartoon characters that you see running around our television screens. Alison will appreciate this. One of the most effective antidotes to nationalism right now is the Liverpool Football Club Twitter feed. If you watch the videos that Liverpool Football Club present and produce, whether it was the Jurgen Klopp one at Christmas, whether it was the one when they won the Premiership, I defy most Scots to not think we can completely identify with the sentiments and sense of affinity being described in those videos. Now, that's not overtly political, but it's a small reminder that what we hold in common is much more than what divides us. And we need like thousands of those people-to-people interactions that remind people how much we've got in common. I think, honestly, more than seminars on Britishness.
Brilliant. And I too would much rather see Alison on the telly than Boris Johnson. So I'm up for that. Alison, quick remarks from you, and then we need to wrap up because we're close.
Lol, I might need to get a better broadband connection if I'm going to do all this television. But anyway, sorry about freezing there. I totally agree with Douglas, by the way, as people might expect, in that when I watched Andy Robertson send Scotland into their first finals for a bazillion years, I screamed my head off in support of him playing for Scotland just as much as when he's playing for Liverpool. And that's because identity is a complex mess of all kinds of things. And I remember when my mum met Gordon Brown for the first time, and she wanted to talk to him about her great-grandfather who was from Fife. And like, our identities are this wonderful mess of different things. And I think Christabel makes that point really well. The philosopher Amartya Sen described binary identities where we're forced to choose, are you this or are you that, as the source of violence in our world. And he was right. It's only when we see our identities as broad, complex, as Beth said, intersecting, changing over time, that actually, as Douglas puts it so well, you understand that the best way to express your identity is to show, not tell. It's indefinable because it's so complex. But actually, we know it when we see it, and we certainly know it when we feel it. So I think we should embrace identity in its complexity, but understand that our Labour identity sends us into politics to get things for people. And if we end up by 2024 or 2025 with 35, maybe higher percentage of children growing up in poverty, that is an offence to our Labour identity. And we can bring people with us with that sense of passion in how our country needs to change. And then they will see our patriotic sense of identity about our Britishness, and they will want to bring their kind of Britishness to us, whatever that else, whether they're a Londoner, whether they're from the Southwest, as someone was mentioning in the chat. So I think it's recognise the complexity, but embrace that, don't worry about it, and show, don't tell. And I think if we stick to those principles, people will see us for the patriotic souls that we are.
Thanks very much, Alison, and thanks for ending on such an upbeat note. Thank you to our audience for attending. Profuse apologies for Douglas being upside down. For some of you, don't know quite why the tech is doing that. But thank you most of all to our brilliant panel. We do have another Scottish Fabians event tomorrow on education. I hope you'll tune in and enjoy the rest of the event, and hope to see you there. Thank you. Bye-bye.